now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. In 2004, the FBI was tipped off to a gruesome pattern of unsolved murders along American roadways. Today, at least 850 homicides have been linked to a solitary breed of predators, long-haul truck drivers. They have been given names like the truck stop killer, who rigged a traveling torture chamber in the rear of his truck and is suspected to have killed 50 women, and the Interstate Strangler, who once answered a phone call from his mother while killing one of his dozen victims. The crisis was such that the FBI opened a special unit, the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. In many cases, the victims, often at-risk women, are picked up at truck stops in one jurisdiction, sexually assaulted and murdered in another, and dumped along a highway in a third place. The transient nature of the offenders and multiple jurisdictions involved make these cases incredibly difficult to solve. Based on his own on-the-ground research and drawing on his 25-year career as an FBI special agent, Frank Figliuzzi investigates the most terrifying cases. He also rides in a big rig with a long-haul trucker for thousands of miles, gaining an intimate understanding of the life and habits of drivers and their roadside culture. And he interviews the courageous trafficked victims of these crimes and their inspiring efforts to now help others avoid similar fates. Long Haul is a gripping exploration of a violent, disordered world hiding in plain sight, and the heroes racing to end the horror. It will forever unsettle how you travel on the road. The book that we're featuring this evening is Long Haul, Hunting the Highway Serial Killers, with my special guest, former FBI Assistant Director and National Security Contributor for NBC News and author, Frank Figliuzzi. Welcome to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, Frank Figliuzzi.
Thank you, Dan. I'm thrilled to be a part of this and be a small part of what you've been doing for 14, 15 years. So thanks for having.
Thank you so much. You take us right into this book, Long Haul, Hunting the Highway Serial Killers. You offer a dramatic example of what readers will discover in the following pages, and they'll hear from you in this interview. You take us to April Fool's Day, 1990. Arizona State Trooper Mike Miller spots a truck with its hazard lights on the shoulder of I-10 in Casa Grande. Tell us what he finds.
Yeah, the Casa Grande, if anybody's ever driven between Phoenix and Tucson, the Casa Grande marks the halfway point on I-10. And this trooper sees the truck, hazard lights on, gets out of his car, puts his trooper hat on, and approaches the cab of the truck. And that's when he hears the screams of a young woman who is shackled in the back of the cab and naked, except for a pair of fuzzy lion bedroom slippers. And he realizes, I've got a problem here. And that driver was Robert Ben Rhodes, who we later find out was a notorious killer who may have killed as many as 50 people, mostly women. This begins a massive investigation. Amongst Robert Ben Rhodes' victims was a 14-year-old girl whose body is found only later, much later, in an abandoned Illinois farmhouse. This 14-year-old was hitchhiking with her boyfriend outside of Houston, Texas. The boyfriend and her were picked up by Rhodes. The boyfriend was quickly killed because he was a mere speed bump in the way. And then for the next weeks, Rhodes proceeds to rape and torture Regina Walters at his discretion. The cruelty of Rhodes is really mind-blowing. At one point, he actually anonymously calls Regina's father, who of course is distraught over where Regina may or may not be.
Yes.
And he says, I've made some changes. I've cut her hair, and he hangs up. I tell the story of Regina in the book because, number one, it's ghastly, but the photos that Rhodes took of her just before he killed her are seared into my brain, because if you see these photos of Regina Walters, you're looking at a girl who's been tortured and raped, knows she may be killed, and her hair's been cut into a short bob. She's been forced into a black dress and high heels. And the look on her face and the body language is someone who is really pleading to not be raped again. Her arms are outstretched. The look on her face is ghastly. And it's something that really sticks with you.
Now, you were a former FBI assistant director and 25 years as special agent. And
True.
You talk about The Long Haul, this book project, its origins beginning in 2021 with The Conversation. Tell us about that conversation and who that was with and how this was the impetus for this book to begin.
Yeah, I kind with all my various leadership roles around the FBI, I kind of prided myself on how much I knew about the corners of the FBI, the nooks and crannies of the FBI. At one time, I was the chief inspector of the FBI, which meant I had to audit programs everywhere in the FBI. And so people think, oh, well, Frank has probably written a book about something he's worked here in the FBI. Well, that's not true. The truth is that I knew little to nothing about the highway serial killer initiative inside the FBI until I retired and had a discussion with the woman who has headed up this initiative, the HSK, within the FBI. She's assigned to Behavioral Analysis Unit 4 at Quantico, Virginia. And I said, what do you do for a living? And she said, I head up the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, we have an initiative involving at least 850 murders that we know of alongside our nation's roadways that we believe are committed by long-haul truckers. And I said, okay, you got to tell me more. And she did. I had to learn more myself. That's the investigator in me. I had to dig deeply. The FBI can't talk about pending investigations. And so I knew that and I respected that, but now I had to know more. And this is my journey. This book is really the story of my journey into three cultures: long haul trucking, for which, by the way, I rode over 2,000 miles with a long haul trucker on a flatbed across the country to try to get deep into the long haul trucking culture and understand it. Then second culture I dig into is trafficking, sex trafficking, because the vast majority of these victims, 850 of them, are indeed sex trafficking victims. And then thirdly, of course, the crime analysis, the behavioral analysis of these crimes and the people who work to connect the dots to stop the killing. So it's a book about three cultures focused around the most heinous killers, the most compelling victims, really a deep dive into trafficking and crime analysis.
Let's talk about Catherine Devane and the Highway Serial Killings Initiative.
Yeah, indeed. One of the people I spent a great deal of time with was Catherine Devane. And by the way, that is a pseudonym. Serial killers tend to be a bit unpleasant. And so the head of the initiative is, asked me to please use an alias. And I did. And she's been doing this for 17 years. And her job is to lead a team that gathers the data from local, county, and state law enforcement agencies around the country with regard to their unsolved highway killings. And she starts connecting the dots. And yes, there are filters and algorithms, but quite honestly, also, It is brain power. It is their knowledge and expertise that says this one looks like that one. And I get deep in the book into commonalities, something called victimology, of course, which is the study of how a victim comes to be the victim, what the crime scene looks like. Are they redheads? And I get deep into the well-known series of murders called the redhead murders along our nation's highways committed by truckers. Are they shot? Are they strangled? Are they duct taped? If so, where? Are they found in a ditch, under a tree, or in water? Is their own clothing used to strangle them or to gag them? Are they raped before they die or post-mortem? All of this is discussed in the book because those are the details that matter. Those are the details that connect one case to another. And then, of course, even when you've connected cases because of those commonalities, well, that's nice, but you then have to solve the case by finding the killer. And this initiative is based on the premise that law enforcement agencies will enter their data and allow the FBI to make those connections. That's the key. And part of Catherine Devane's job is getting out there on the road, preaching the gospel of the HSK to police departments who often say, look, we're a small department, we're a sheriff's office. We don't have an analyst to enter the data. There's like 200 questions on these FBI forms that you've got to fill out about your victim, your crime scene, your location, your murder. And if you don't answer those questions, the FBI is really challenged. In fact, sometimes this unit at Quantico, Virginia, will simply pick up a lead from reading the newspaper. They'll say, look at this. This happened in Alabama. And doesn't this look like the thing that happened, the murder that happened in Oklahoma? It's those kinds of connections that get made.
You're talking about that she's trying to impress to law enforcement agencies about the importance of entering information into the FBI's VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, because, as you say, it's essential that they put that information in. You also chronicle in the book the reasons why on earth they wouldn't enter information into this database.
Yeah, the HSKI, Highway Serial Killings Initiative, is a sub-database within VICAP, and many, many police departments don't even know it exists. So again, a large part of the FBI's job is education and awareness. And then, as to reasons why that data may not get entered at all, you got everything from a lack of resources and budget to lack of computer resources. Again, some of these departments don't even have a crime analyst, let alone sometimes they don't have detectives. If you've got a state, a county sheriff's office, for example, whose job is road patrol, and they're stuck with this case, somebody's got to do this. And in some cases, the FBI will help get a grant from DOJ to get that analytical resource. Sometimes, if you've got a series of cases, they'll fly out to you and say, "Look, we'll enter the data for you, but this is garbage in, garbage out. We can't help you if we don't know about your case."
Now, you include the Nashville Metro Police Department homicide detective Pat Postiglione, and he caught up with long hauler killer Bruce Mendenhall sitting in his vehicle at a Tennessee truck stop. Tell us about this case and this officer and Bruce Mendenhall.
Yeah, Mendenhall is another notorious repeated serial killer. And actually, this was a good news story, if there's any such thing in this business. By that, I mean, he was captured within 2 weeks of one of his murders. And sometimes these things go on for literally decades. Decades, meaning sometimes it's decades before the police even know the name of a victim. DNA, by the way, no surprise, is now solving many of these cold cases where a detective says, "Well, let me enter the DNA and see what happens." And bingo, now we get a connection to a killer or to DNA found on another victim years ago. And that, by the way, that happened a couple of times while I was writing this book. I had to, I thought I had a comprehensive understanding of all the cases, and then I had set alerts on Google Alerts to alert me if another development occurred in any case involving truckers and killers. And bingo, I had a couple happen while I was writing the book, and I had to insert them. So the story
Wow.
of the story of, yeah, so it's very much still happening. This is not a history book. It is, but it's also still very much real time. So Mendenhall, interesting story. And there's something really kind of spooky that happens to me personally, I'll share with you. But he grabs a girl named Sarah Nicole Hulbert at a truck stop. And yes, she is a trafficking victim related to that truck stop. It's one of the rare truck stops that is in a downtown area of a city. You don't usually see that, but the highway dumps you off quickly into Nashville. And this truck stop was there. And he grabs her there. Now, a really sharp detective named Pat Pastiglione, Nashville PD, is working, gets assigned that case. And he's, occasionally he's surveilling that truck stop afterwards just to get familiar with it. And sure enough, he sees this truck. It seems suspicious to him, the way the driver's acting. And he decides he's going to walk up and talk to the driver. And he says something to Mendenhall like, "Are you the guy we're looking for?" And Mendenhall shrugs his shoulders and says, "If you say so." And in that truck, Pastiglione finds basically a mobile crime scene. He's got blood from 5 different victims in there. He's got sex toys and knives and guns and pornography. It's then that Pastiglione knows, of course, that he's got his man. Now, ironically, as I'm on the road researching this book, I happen to find myself riding through Nashville, past Nashville. And I've spent a week with this particular driver who was gracious enough to have me sleep in his cab and ride along with him for thousands of miles. And I go, "Look, it is time for me to go home. We've got to find an airport that I can get to and get home." And we realized the next big city coming up with an airport is Nashville. And I am, as many people who spend a long time in a truck, I'm in need of a shower. And so he goes, "Look, we'll pull off in Nashville. We'll stop at this truck stop, and you can take a shower at the truck stop and then take an Uber to the airport." And as I'm inside this truck stop and I'm showering, I start thinking about where I am. And I realize I am at the very same truck stop where Mendenhall killed Sarah Hulbert and where Mendenhall was arrested as well. That, there were coincidences throughout my trip, but this one really struck me.
You say in your journey with this truck driver you call Mike, you learned of the many characteristics of truckers that would lend themselves to an environment conducive to serial killing.
Yeah, again, 25 years as an FBI agent, I didn't want to write a book that just regurgitated high-profile killer truckers. I mean, many true crime fans know many of these murders and many of these victims. I didn't want to write that book. I wanted to write a book that said, and by the way, I'm an investigator and I have my own theories. I want to ask the questions like, which truckers are more likely to be killers? I also ask the question, which victims, which kinds of sex trafficked women and girls are more likely to be killed? This is the kind of thing that I'm trained to do as an FBI agent. And I wanted to kind of help my colleagues in law enforcement to focus more squarely. So, for example, when I asked the head of this FBI initiative, so look, you've got about 850 killings that you know of over the years. You're telling me that 25 long-haul truckers are already in prison for multiple murders. And yet you're telling me there's also about 200 cases that are considered unsolved and active. How many suspects do you have right now that you're actively working in these unsolved cases? The answer staggered me. It was 450 suspects right now.
Wow.
That are on the road. So I say that to say that I wanted to get in the weeds about, okay, how do we break this down? There's just too many truckers. And so I get into the different kinds of trucking. There's a hierarchy of trucking. You've got people at the high end of the pay scale that are doing flatbed. I happen to ride flatbed. What does that mean? It means you've got to have some knowledge of math and physics, weight distribution, strapping and chaining and tarping your load, meeting mandatory DOT requirements for points of securement based on the size and weight of your load. You've got to determine whether you can even get gas today because your load's too heavy or not. You're physically engaged with the load because you are the one that is doing the chains and straps. One day we picked up and carried what's called a suicide coil, which is an incredibly heavy roll of steel, and that has to be chained and strapped and secured properly. And why is it called a suicide coil? Because if you do it wrong and it's not secured, it could roll right through the back of your cab. So you don't want that happening. So I go through, and those people are paid well, but even more higher pay is for truckers who do the heavy loads that you see on the highway, with the follow car and the lead car. Hey, wide load, heavy load. Or there's also something called low boys. Low boys are inches off the ground because their cargo, their load is extremely tall and requires the lower profile truck so it can fit under bridges and such. You've got hazmat, people who carry hazmat, they're well paid. You've got reefer drivers, that refers to refrigerated trucks where our nation's produce is transported. And then you have what's called the dry vanners, the guys and gals who are carrying, dry goods, a load of Kleenex from California to North Carolina. That's the simplest form of driving. I'm not saying it's easy, but their physical engagement with the load consists of opening the back door when they drop off their load. So I get into the psychology of that, who does what, and who's more likely to be the killer. I also talk about corporate drivers, big names we all are familiar with. We see it on the side of the trailers, right? J.B. Hunt, Warner, etc. And the high-tech monitoring that goes on in those companies, making it a little less likely that driver has the time to kill and the opportunity to kill. I talk about owner-operators who have a little more free license and less monitoring. I do the same thing for the victim side and talk about the different kinds of sex trade and pimp-controlled girls. And I say girls, by the way, because some of them are literally not women yet. They're minors. Most start as minors in the trafficking world. And I get into, whether a pimp-controlled girl or a renegade or an outlaw, these are different terminology. This is different terminology that describes trafficking victims. Who's more likely to die? And some of the theories in the book, I hope, may help law enforcement.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop to hear these messages. You talk about also the analysis of the kinds of offenders that have been seen in these trucker serial killing cases and now are seeing more recently. So tell us about the type of offenders that have been analyzed.
Yeah, there's not. So I'm careful to say, after talking to the experts, that there's not a huge distinction between the average, if there is such a thing as an average serial killer, and a trucker serial killer. There are, of course, some obvious distinctions, but essentially, serial killers, including the truckers, fall into one of two categories. The first one is where the killer simply enjoys the power of life and death. He gets off on that, and even to the point of sexual satisfaction. Often, those people take their time killing. They like that feeling of prolonged power and control. And they often will rape their victims, perhaps multiple times, as Robert Ben Rhodes did. And then there's the second kind of killer who dispatches with his victims very quickly because he's about killing. He just wants to kill. And it's not so much about sex. Now, he may again become aroused with the killing and thinking about it afterwards and take a souvenir, but he's going to kill very quickly. He's about the killing, often not interested in sex at all.
Tell us about the reality of the trucking industry and the intersection between addicted women and the reality of the trucking industry and commercial sex.
Yeah, there's a long history here, and I get into that in the book, even in the days where there was widespread usage of the CB radio, which happens less today. but it was all about the CB radio. And of course, CB radio back then was kind of let's say, the social media of the trucking world. People would get to know each other. They would talk incessantly truckers would talk incessantly to other truckers. They talk about their kids and their family, and where the good food was and where the cheapest gas was. And hey, look out ahead because there's a traffic jam. Bad weather's coming. All of that happened on the CB radio. But you know what else happened on the CB radio? Advertising for sex. And there's a whole language of that I get into in the book and explain the coded language, and truckers would say, who would pull into a truck stop would say to the would-be sexual partner, yeah, I'm in the red house in the corner. Well, that's the red truck in the corner of the truck stop. And the advertising would happen there and the communication would happen there. And so a lot of back then, it still happens today, but to a much lesser extent, it was actually physical transactions were happening in the truck stops, in the parking lot, in the truck itself. These trafficked women would work the parking lots or the restaurants at the truck stop. And that's how they do it, often with a pimp watching or nearby, or what's called a bottom. And I get into that language of its own there. A bottom is kind of the deputy to the pimp, the assistant to the pimp. It's a girl, a woman who's been around and who the pimp trusts. And she's worked the business herself, and she's very close watching. That's a pimp controlled situation. And it happened, the whole thing is it happened in the truck and at the truck stop. Okay, where I move fast forward to today, and much of this has gone online, no surprise. The advertising usually occurs online. Even as I was traveling, I was checking out spots on the internet that cater to sex and truckers, ads from women saying, I'm trucker friendly. I'll come to you, or you can come to me. And a lot of this has gone to, as the truck stop industry, boy, is that a big industry. I get into that in the book too, man. We're talking, $1 billion industry here. And by the way, they're buying each other up. So it's connected, TA, Travel America, and all of these loves and the other big ones, they're kind of consolidating, and trucking companies actually get discounts by joining the club of one of those truck stops. So they get the drivers get discounted gas, they get discounted showers or free showers at those truck stops. But today it's gone offline. It's gone online, excuse me. And so it happens at massage parlors near the truck stop, or cheap motels near the truck stop. Or the woman will show up after an online agreement at the truck stop. And I asked the question in the book, is that more or less dangerous than the physical plying of your trade at the truck stop itself? You could argue that making that sex and money transaction happen at a truck stop might actually be safer, in the sense that a victim can kick and scream and bang on the window of the truck. And somebody's probably going to hear it, and a pimp or a bottom is watching nearby and could come to the rescue, as could other truckers. And maybe this is more dangerous now, as a woman, a victim, is exposing herself in a room alone at a cheap motel. I get into that as well.
You take us to a case that exemplifies what victimology is all about. Cases like the Redhead murders in West Memphis, Arkansas, September 1984. Can you tell us about the Redhead murders?
Yeah, and most of your listeners who are really into true crime, they're going to know about the Redhead murders. In fact, there's even been high school criminal justice classes where high school kids have devoted a semester or more to studying and trying to solve the Redhead killings. And the bottom line is that while we're looking at somewhere, we can't even get agreement on how many victims are part of the Redhead killings, but there's something between 10 and 14. That's where we're looking at. And these are historical. They're not happening anymore. Definitely there's been one suspect that's good for several of them, but not necessarily all of them. So I consider the Redhead killings to be only partially solved. And again, this gets deep into the victimology. When you've got, it's very interesting when you've got the same hair color happening, the same build, the same age range. But that's what we have with the redhead killings. Historically, red or auburn hair, fair-skinned complexion, and without a doubt, the suspect and suspects had this is a preferential killing. This victim meets their criteria, in this case because of hair color. And they weren't in one location. They were absolutely kind of most of them along I-40, which runs east to west across the southern United States, all the way to California. That's where a lot of this happened. Tennessee, Kentucky, particularly for the redhead killings.
You talk about a girl and you say the title of the chapter is Girls Next Door. And again, probably an alias, Hannah Everett.
Yes.
Tell us what you learned from speaking with Hannah Everett.
Yeah, I'm going to admit, I'll make a confession of my own here, that I think I had a bias. That is that, well, trafficked victims, young ladies who fall into the trafficking trap, they probably come from a disadvantaged background and bad families and blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm wrong. I'm wrong about that. And if nothing else, this book could open people's eyes that trafficking can happen to someone you know. So two of the victims I spoke to, who, by the way, survived violent encounters with truckers. They truly are survivors. And these two women in particular, I consider thrivers. They'll tell you, I am no longer a victim. I am a thriver. I am a survivor and a thriver. In fact, both of these women are now associated with organizations that help other women get out of the trafficking trap. But my point on kind of breaking my bias about who falls victim to this, one of these women was a preacher's kid from the Midwest. The other, Hannah, you're referring to, and that is a pseudonym for her. The other woman didn't request a pseudonym. Her name is Nancy Yarborough. She's got a great story. But Hannah came from the Midwest, had a year of college. She's white, has blue eyes. This is not, this is not someone you think this would have happened to. The family, went to church. But as I talked to these women, in my mind, I started checking off the commonalities that I was taught by two of the top experts in the country on trafficking. And those two experts, they are kind of hands-on, on the street, doing work that gets people out, the help they need to get out of the trafficking trap. And so I was very impressed, but they taught me the commonalities to look for. And sure enough, I would talk to these victims and survivors. And in my mind, here we go. I'm seeing the trauma at an early age. Often that means unwanted touching or sexual molestation. I'm seeing a tower of trauma, I call it, in their lives. Someone close to them dies, the family member dies, there's divorce, there's fighting, there's domestic incidents. Then there's early drug use is very common to see. Then there's a series of bad boyfriends, and the drug use gets heavier and heavier, and mental health issues and drug abuse are frequently found in these cases. And the other takeaway here, and again, the experts support this, is, again, if you think, well, this can't happen to someone in my family or my neighborhood, it does. It does. This kind of myth is out there from the movies and TV that we see a stranger abduction, a young girl is thrown into the back of a van, never to be seen again, trafficked internationally. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but that's rare. But what is far more common is that someone in their own circle, their own network of friends and relations, eventually grooms and convinces them to be trafficked. And if you were to ask them at that age, hey, are you a trafficking victim? They would look at you and say, I don't know what you're talking about. My boyfriend has me, in a business where I have sex for money. And okay, but only later do they go, wait a minute, I I was trafficked. And it gets worse from there as the drug addiction and the mental illness and trauma take over. And then your judgment simply flies out the window, and you're putting yourself literally in harm's way every day, multiple times a day.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop to hear these messages. You talk of what you've learned from the pioneer professor, Dr. Celia Williamson, and her fight against human trafficking and prostitution at the University of Toledo, and director of the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute and the Second Chance program. And then you also talk about, of course, Terry Turner, Oklahoma crime analyst. So let's talk about some of the initiatives some of the things you learned from Dr. Celia Williamson, and also the initiatives by Terry Turner.
Yeah, there are killers in my book, but there are also heroes in my book. And you've just mentioned some of those heroes. I can't say enough good things about Dr. Celia Williamson and the Second Chance program and the work she's doing to really make a difference in her community. And the same goes for Dr. Dominique Rowe-Sepowitz at Arizona State. Dr. Sepowitz has a place called Starfish Place in Phoenix, Arizona. It's a joint effort between the city of Phoenix and Arizona State University. It's a residential program. I visited there myself. I had to see it for myself, see the young ladies. It's specifically for young women who have young children, and those women want to come out of trafficking. And they get their own apartment on this campus, this facility, and all the help they need. The support system is there. The education opportunities are there. Life awareness, life coaching, all of that's there to help them on their way, including, in many cases, free or subsidized housing. That is the key to getting them away from their pimp or their bad boyfriend relationship. And occasionally, it's a very secure campus, locked down, because sometimes those pimps will show up trying to get their girl back. But I visited there. I was completely impressed. And Dr. Sepowitz also is doing some amazing research. I mean, she was the first one that pointed out the trafficking that goes on, particularly of underage victims, at major American events like the Super Bowl. And she has received grants to study trafficking at the Super Bowl. People with money traveling from all over the world to get those really expensive tickets to watch the Super Bowl. These are big players, right? For some reason, they decide it's time also to pay for sex, often of underage people. And she's done some amazing work in that area with the police. And she's also one of the people, like Dr. Williamson, who says this nonsense about handcuffing trafficking victims and charging them with crimes, this has to stop. And she's really made the police departments in places like Phoenix and in Las Vegas very much change their practice. It's also happened in Toledo with Dr. Williamson and the sheriff's department in Ohio that say, look, when they come upon a victim, they say, you're not getting arrested today. You are going to be asked what you need to get away from this lifestyle. I say lifestyle, it's a victimization, is what it is. It's trafficking, generally it's involuntary servitude. But this is very successful, because here comes not just the police, but the social services people partnering with the police. So if that young woman says, well, what I need is a roof over my head to get out of this situation, or what I need is a certificate so I can go cut hair for a living, or whatever it is they want to do. I need diapers for my baby. How am I supposed to survive if I don't make this income? And they change the dynamic. And I'm very impressed by those two heroes. And then you mentioned Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation crime analyst Terry Turner, who retired right after I wrote the book. She is the mother of this HSKI. Why do I say that? It was Terry Turner who many decades ago said, we've got a problem. And, you can imagine, say 40 years ago, a female crime analyst in Oklahoma who is kind of becoming a pest to her leadership by saying, hey, listen to me. There are young ladies from Oklahoma missing, and they're turning up dead in other states. And I think that this is being done by truckers. Look at this one. Look at that one. And she started, in about a year or two, she started piling up victims. She calls them her girls, quote unquote, her girls, where she eventually had 10 victims from Oklahoma who were turning up dead. And she pounded her fist on the desk. She demanded the FBI get involved. In fact, she called for a meeting. She sent out a teletype to nationally to homicide detectives and said, look, we're going to have a meeting here in Oklahoma City. If you've got unsolved highway killings, please come to the meeting. We'll share notes. She thought maybe she'd get 10 or 15 detectives show up. She had dozens show up, and they all had similar cases. And the FBI showed up and went, holy cow, yes, you've met the criteria for a serial killings case, and we're going to help you. That was the birth of the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative.
You talk about this initiative also, you say you call it a baptism of sorts, when in the murky waters of serial killings of September 2003, where a body was found near I-40 in Tiger Mountain, Oklahoma. The thing is, she reached out to other law agencies to look for commonalities and similarities in other cases, and she wound up involved in a case where a serial killer was killing every month. Tell us about this case.
Yeah, Oklahoma was the start of this whole initiative. And, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that you take away from the book is there are definitely hubs of trafficking with regard to interstate travel. And you can figure these out by looking at the intersections of major interstate highways that converge in a particular city. By the way, Toledo is one of those. But another place where that happens is in Oklahoma, and in the Oklahoma City area particularly. What does that mean? It means, well, you have an inordinately high number of long-haul truckers passing through. It means that you have a very high percentage of trafficked women to so-called service those truckers. And of course, in this book, it means, and in this business, it means you have an inordinately high percentage of victims coming from your city. And that is what Terry Turner realized was happening. She connected those dots and said, this points to truckers. Tiger Mountain was a place where truckers, there was a rest stop there. It was a logical place if you're traveling along in Ohio, but it was also really wooded, forested, remote, and the victims, the trafficking victims knew that, so that they would work that area, that rest stop. The truckers knew where they could go to pay for sex. And without a doubt, when somebody accidentally stumbled upon a body at Tiger Mountain, that was helping to kick off Terry Turner's interest in this whole thing.
Now, tell us about what happens in this initiative involving the study of sex worker advertisements, probably by pimps or by those workers that work independently, but also what someone in this team discovered would be to utilize that same advertising to their advantage. Can you explain?
Yeah, and specifically, we're talking about Professor Dominique Rosepowitz at Arizona State University, again, the director of Starfish Place as well in Phoenix. So she got grant money. It's all about, it's all about people and governments saying, look, we'll help. We'll get you the money to do this study, this research. And she was on the cutting edge of this. And the application of actually technology and algorithms and filters to look at, it's kind of a nice creative way to do this. She was particularly looking for underage trafficking of juveniles. And she has helped police departments through this grant money she's gotten to develop the use of technology to identify likely advertisements of minors for sex. So she's focused on keywords and phrases: new, young, first timer, and a photo, which may or may not be the actual victim, but a photo of a very young girl. And all of this language, points to the trafficking of someone who's underage. And she then did tests of different markets. It happened in a Super Bowl that was played at the Meadowlands in New Jersey one year. It's happened in Las Vegas PD, Metro PD has adopted this and used it. And it was used to study the marketplace for underage trafficking and really the men who pay for this. And one of the things they did was focus on those so-called Johns, the men who pay for these services, and do something different. First, law enforcement doesn't pay enough attention to holding the Johns accountable, right? We see girls arrested, but we don't see a lot of arrests of men, which really is all about supply and demand. That you've got to attack the demand side if you're going to get around helping the supply side and mitigating that. So the police agreed in the Super Bowl situation in Phoenix and in Las Vegas. They said, you know what? We're going to do something different. We're going to tackle the men. What they would do is undercover type work. They'd set out these ads that they knew were typical of underage advertising. And they would, if a guy called in or made contact online and said, yeah, I want you at my hotel room tonight, the undercover officer would call and say, well, actually, there are two different ways to do this. Sometimes they were undercover. Sometimes they were just at the police department. They would call the guy back and go, you just made contact with someone who is with law enforcement. And by the way, this ad advertises underage minors. And if you understand something, if you do this again, you're going to prison. And this is fake this time. But if you do it for real, you're done. And to my amazement, some of these guys would say, oh, okay, yeah, sorry about that. And then pick up the phone and they'd make contact with another undercover ad for underage. Then the police would show up, of course, if they could identify this person. And it really has helped in real life. So it's done two things. You've got this kind of undercover thing that's attacking the demand side. And then on the supply side, for real ads, the police would then agree that they're going to make contact with that real advertiser, that woman, and they're going to say, come to my motel. This happens a lot in Phoenix. And then when that young lady shows up, she realizes that this is about her, that the law enforcement isn't there to arrest her, but rather people like Professor Sepowitz and her social partners are going to offer medical services, mental health services, addiction services. They're going to say, do you need a place to stay? All of that's going to happen right in that motel, It's been hugely successful. Very few of those young ladies go, no thanks, and walk away.
You talk about the case of Casey Joe Pipestem and also America's Most Wanted. Can you tell us about this and John Williams?
Yeah. Here's another Oklahoma case. Casey Joe Pipestem, very young victim who happened to be from the Seminole Nation, a tribe in Oklahoma. She had been passed around family members after her parents were no longer in the picture. She ended up being trafficked, and she indeed was missing, and her body was found in Grapevine, Texas. And again, another outstanding detective from the Grapevine Police Department who really took this case as his own and became passionate about finding Casey Joe Pipestem's killer. But again, this was linked eventually to a trucker, a serial killer. And as they worked this case, it was a rare case too, by the way, that involved a female partner who had knowledge of the wrongdoing, had knowledge of the killings. That's very rare, by the way, in these cases. But long story short, as this remained unsolved, they decided to go to the old America's Most Wanted TV program with John Walsh. And he's come back now, by the way. He's now come back with his adult son, and he's doing a similar program. They feature Casey Joe Pipestem's case, and they get a phone call as a result of that episode. The phone call is from John Williams' aunt, who says, "Hey, I visited my nephew in jail recently, and he said I just killed I killed a little Indian girl, and boy, did that get some attention." Long story short, she was right, and he was in prison for another crime, but detectives then began lining up to interview Williams, all from different states, because they all had unsolved cases. That many believe that certainly Williams was the killer, but I think this illustrates another phenomenon, which is the kind of sense of hope when detectives hear that somebody's been grabbed, someone's in prison, and he might be the one who killed my victims, and then the rush to get in line to do the interview for your case, only to find, this is so common, only to find that, nope, this guy has an alibi. He wasn't even in that part of the country. He wasn't in that place where your victim was killed. And of course, it's a roller coaster of emotion when that happens. And that's why, this initiative is still alive and well, because of, at least 200 unsolved cases.
Let's use this as an opportunity to hear these messages. Getting back to Dr. Sepowitz and what she learned from the ads and how to utilize those ads to her advantage. And you talk about Backpage being one of and Craigslist being a place where these opportunists use those online services to lure women, or young girls, in fact. But you talk about also initiatives like Thorn with actors Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore, and to counter child sex trafficking. So, and also tell us about the McCain Institute, and also how the U.S. Department of Defense even gets involved, and DARPA.
Yeah, that really got my attention, because, a large part of my FBI career was in counterintelligence work, national security work, and ultimately heading up the counterintelligence division of the FBI. So I knew of DARPA. These are really, really bright people in the Department of Defense, scientists, researchers, engineers, who do cutting edge, often classified research for the United States. And when they saw what was happening technology-wise with Arizona State University research, and then even the algorithms developed by Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore to look at to use technology for anti-trafficking. And they came in and said, okay, you've got something here, and we've got something as well that we want to, use. And they came with money. This is, like I said, a lot of this research and grant funding is about high-profile funding, and the big names of celebrities or prominent people in society, like Cindy McCain, the wife of the late Senator John McCain, who has done a lot of good for America. Part of it has to do with her funding of certain anti-trafficking initiatives. So that money was used to further hone and sharpen the technology to do anti-trafficking work through the study of advertisements, and also to kind of, Dr. Sepowitz has done a ton of interviews, and her team have done a lot of interviews of victims, and have come away, when you crunch all that data and you put it in a computer system, you come away with some eye-opening findings. So one of them, by the way, one of those findings was after interviewing, hundreds of victims, was that many of those victims had somewhere in their early education life touched or been associated with special education. Whether they were deemed as a different learner, had learning issues, whatever, they had been in special ed. So what do you do with that? Well, what Dr. Sepowitz has done is develop early intervention programs to educate teachers, to educate young kids in an age-appropriate way, that there are things that people may, have you try to do in life that aren't appropriate, and that you should tell someone you trust about, maybe even tell your teacher. That's a great program. The other thing they found was that a lot of recruitment goes on in jail. So that, in fact, Hannah, who I talked to and describe in the book, she was recruited in part, not only by boyfriends, but when she was arrested and thrown into jail, one of her cellmates turned out to be a bottom, turned out to be part of a stable of prostitutes. And she said to Hannah, listen, when you get out, I'm getting out before you. When you get out, I'll have a place for you to stay. You can stay with me and my boyfriend. We'll take care of you. In fact, I'll put money on your jail account so that you can buy some things and you can call. I'll put money on your phone account. You call me when you know you're getting out. We'll pick you up. We'll take you in. Well, that was a recruitment. This was involuntary servitude that she ended up in, literally. What did Dr. Sepowitz do with that? Well, some prisons now monitor, of course, they monitor your phone activity, but they'll also give laptops to female prisoners and monitor what's going on the laptop, and they'll watch recruitment take place. So it's that kind of cutting edge intervention that's making a difference.
You said in the end of this book that this book started as an interest in the FBI's Highway Serial Killers Initiative, but quickly became a quest to understand the cultures behind the killings. You said that the serial killer initiative also cooperated with vice cops and also, more importantly, the trucking industry. Tell us a little bit about the cooperation that the trucking industry offered this team in trying to solve this incredible problem.
Yeah, this is crucial. We talk a lot about partnerships in law enforcement and in social human services, and it's crucial. So let's talk about the industry itself, the trucking industry. They want to help. No trucking company wants to be associated with a killer or with trafficking. And in the early days of Terry Turner's work, she not only partnered with various police departments, but they had to have the cooperation of major trucking companies, because imagine the needle in the haystack aspect to solving one of these cases. You've got hundreds, if not thousands, of trucks passing through your truck stop where maybe this victim was last seen. How do you determine who was there? Which trucker was there at that particular time? And what's your time frame? Is it, she was last seen there? We think it was either Tuesday or Wednesday a month ago. I don't know. So imagine that you've got to then get, if there's any cameras way back when at this truck stop. Okay, so what? So you've got that. Now who was there? You've got to go to all the trucking companies. You've got to say, I need to know who was at this truck stop Tuesday in your company. And maybe that company has thousands of drivers, thousands of trucks. So they want to help, but they've got to, you've got to give them a time frame, and they'll give you the data. Now today, and I can relate to this from what happened during my entire time in the FBI, 25 years. Early on, when I would approach hotels, businesses, airlines, it was like, yeah, they'd bend over backwards to help you. And yes, what do you need? Yes, do you have a guest who stayed here with this name? Do you, and they yeah, absolutely, here you go. And then you could watch over the years, the lawyers took over, liability, right? And the instruction was very clear to these employees, the leadership at these facilities, and it's true for the trucking companies. Hey, you got to have a search warrant or a subpoena. We want to help you, but but in the early days, and the help still happens, don't get me wrong, but it's more complicated. But that kind of data and then sifting through that, okay, we've identified 100 trucks that were at this truck stop Tuesday a month ago. Okay. Now, who was driving the truck? Well, we think it was Joe. Yeah, it's Joe's truck. Yeah. Unless you switched off with somebody, not sure, but it's probably Joe. Okay, 200 Joes. Let's look at their backgrounds. Joe's got a history of domestic violence. Joe carries a gun. No, a gun wasn't used in this case. It was a knife. Okay, you've got to have the cooperation of the industry. It's essential.
You say that there have been some inroads, especially promising and you cite a case in this incredible case in this book that was solved through genetic genealogy, but still, you write that there is an incredible long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing the impact of genetic genealogy here. And so, real quickly, what's that? It's the law enforcement use of private genealogy databases where people have submitted their DNA. Many people have done this with big name companies. And however, there's only a very small number of companies that will voluntarily give such data to law enforcement. There's one company, I think it's called GED Match, that actually exists to help law enforcement. And that's something your listeners could think about, which is you could submit your DNA to a company like GED Match, knowing that the police use that company to try and match and solve crimes. So how does that work? Well, if they've got DNA from a crime scene and they submit that DNA to the ancestral genealogy company, and then they get a report back saying, oh, you've got a second cousin that has this DNA. And now you've got a family connection, right, between the DNA found at a crime scene and the DNA of someone out there in this database. Now you can start doing some interviews. And that is solving cases. You then approach this maybe second cousin and you go, you got anybody in your family who's a trucker? Well, I heard about an Uncle George a few years ago, may have driven a truck. Okay, thank you. That's happening now with increasing frequency. The other thing that I think is on the horizon is the use of AI, artificial intelligence. We talked a lot today about data and connections and advertising and keywords and phrases and who's more likely to kill or not. I think AI is going to play a major role in the weeks, months, and years ahead.
I want to thank you very much for coming on and talking about your incredible journey to find out the truth about this entire subcultures that converge with each other in this incredible book, Long Haul: Hunting the Highway Serial Killers. For people that want to check out more about this book, do you have a website or do any social media?
Oh, for sure. I am on Twitter at Frank Figliuzzi 1. I should say I'm on X at Frank Figliuzzi.
Yeah, right.
I'm also on Threads. I'm on Instagram, and my website where you can get all the details, not only about the book, but all my TV appearances as a national security contributor for NBC News, all my appearances related to this book, and my old podcast called The Bureau, all about the FBI and interviews of active FBI employees. You can get all that on my website, which is simply frankfigliuzzi.com.
Thank you so much, Frank Figliuzzi, for Long Haul: Hunting the Highway Serial Killers. Thank you so much for this interview, and you have a great evening and good night.
Good night to you.
Thank you so much.